Welcome to my first ever Q&A video. Hopefully this isn't going to be my last, but we'll see how it goes. So I put a post out a few days ago asking for you guys to put any questions that you had towards me regarding photography or videography or any such thing like that. And I have had a few which I'm going to answer in the course of this video, but this is going to be a Q&A video with a slight difference because whilst I'm answering your questions, I've also got a little computer rebuild project that I'm going to be doing and discussing that as we go. Now, in terms of the rebuild, unfortunately, it's nothing quite as exciting as I've bought all these brand new components and I'm making this new supercomputer. It's a bit more mundane than that. I need to take the contents of this computer and put them all in a new case. Now, the basic reason why I need to do this switch is I'm a complete muppet, but we'll discuss that in a bit more detail as we go through. For starters, we'll get the contents of this out whilst I go through your first question. So I have the old computer case, I have a new computer case, I have a toolbox, and I have the dog. Didn't really think this through, did I? You just stay down there. I'm sure he'll be back to help me in a bit. Now, the first question we'll tackle is from Steve Mozzie. He says, at what point does a composition, story, etc. beat the quality of an image? Now, Steve, I presume when you're talking about the quality of an image, you're talking about the resolution, the sharpness of the image, and the quality of the bokeh, that sort of thing. I've always been a firm believer that the quality of an image is more down to the composition and the lighting and the story rather than the quality of the gear that you're using to take the photo with. Case in point for this, for me, you've only got to look back at the famous, the timeless photos, if you like, from years gone by. Photos like that protester standing alone in front of a column of tanks, or the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. Those pictures that have nowhere near the clarity that you can get from modern day cameras, but the content within them, the story that they are portraying, is timeless, and that's why they have stood the test of time. That's not to say that the detail within the image doesn't have a role to play, but it's an afterthought. I would say that good quality equipment can't rescue a bad photo, but poor quality equipment is still capable of taking a really good photo. I have seen it before, a few videos actually, of people, professional photographers who swap gear with amateur photographers or hobbyist photographers. So you've got a professional using fairly budget level equipment, and you get an amateur who's got a couple of grand's worth of really high-end equipment, and they go out to locations and they shoot in the same locations, and they see who can come up with what images. And every time without fail, the professional comes up with the better looking images because they focus more on the composition and the lighting. Obviously, better equipment will help improve your images, but you've got to have the good images there to begin with, if you like. So basically, to answer your question, at what point does composition? For me, pretty much straight away. So I hope that answers your question. And so far, this dissection isn't really going too well. And this is kind of the short of why I need to change my case, because I just do not have any space in here. Now let's tackle another question. John Brigenti, I'm sorry John if I screwed that name up. I just bought the A7 III. Am I crazy for downgrading to a lower megapixel count than my A7 R2, or am I a genius for upgrading to a faster autofocus, animal eye autofocus, more focus points, bigger buffer, etc.? Full disclosure, question's probably moot because I'm keeping the R2 anyway. Well, fair enough, John. I mean, if you're keeping the R2, it really doesn't make much of a difference, but just in case you weren't, or weren't considering or whatever, this really comes down to what are you using it for, what do you need it for, what suits your needs. It's much like everything, really. You know, if you're shooting a lot of sports, a lot of wildlife, then the autofocus system on the A7 III is phenomenal. The R2, I can't really comment because I've never actually used it in person, but from what I've seen of others, it's a little bit lackluster. But then that kind of makes sense because the RB in high resolution is probably more focused towards landscape shooters. And landscape shooters don't need really fast autofocus. So it comes down to what you need, and that's kind of what I did with my camera. You know, I had the choice between the A7 III and the A7R III. The R3 was a little bit more expensive, and I decided that I didn't need an extra 20 odd megapixels. The 24 of the A7 III works perfectly fine for me. I've never had more than, in fact 24 is the highest I've ever had. I have a random screw holding a hard drive in place. Ugh. And yes, you might have noticed there's a lot of hard drives coming out of this machine. And there's another one to go in, which is the root cause of what's caused me all of these bloody problems in the first place. You see, my hard drive setup was that I had an M.2 SSD built into the motherboard, which stores my Windows install and my editing software. I then have a 1 terabyte SSD drive that I use as a project file. So then whatever project I am currently working on, whether it be videos or photos or whatever, they get copied onto the project drive, so I've got as fast a file transfer as possible between the storage and the software. I then have 3 2 terabyte HDD spin disk drives, which I use more as an archive. So I have one to archive my videos, one to archive my pictures, and then the third one as a miscellaneous that I can put games or whatever else I want to put on. And then a few weeks ago, one of my spin disk drives suddenly developed a squeaking noise. Now, general consensus amongst the computer community is that when a hard drive starts making squeaking noises, it's developing an issue, it's starting to come to the end of its life, and at some point it's gonna just cut out on you. And I didn't really fancy that happening, so I decided to nip the problem before it became a major issue, and I would get myself a new hard drive. Now, through process of elimination by unplugging hard drives, I'd established, or what I thought I'd established, was that the video archive drive was the one that was squeaking. So I decided I'd buy a replacement, but rather than stick with another 2 terabyte drive, seeing as how obviously video files are quite big, I would up it to a larger capacity one, and found a Seagate 4 terabyte. Now, I was already limited on space anyway, because this case, it supports 2 3.5-inch drives down at the bottom here, which I had 2 of them in, and then it's got mounting points here for a solid state drive wedged up against the side, which I put in. Then there's no mounting plates for anything else, but there is space for some 5.5-inch optical drives that I don't have and never use, haven't used for years. And there's a little shelf that separates that compartment from the rest of the case, so I decided to stick one of the drives just loose in there, and then all of the cables that were coming out of the power supply, whatever wasn't running down the case to the various components, was all stuffed in there out the way. Trying to get the drive in and out was an absolute pain. To be fair, I was probably beyond the limit of space. But anyway, when I come to putting the new drive in, I then ran into a problem that for some reason, whenever I tried to initiate it and then access the drive, it just wasn't having it. And I couldn't work out why. It was just every time I tried to go close to accessing the drive, Windows would just crash. Now, initially, I thought it was possibly a dud drive, a faulty drive. So I was all set to return the damn thing when, just by, I don't know, pure fluke, a bit of a miracle, I unplugged one of the other drives and booted it back up, and suddenly the other drive worked perfectly fine. And that was when I realised what I'd done. Muppet, I'd overloaded the power supply. Whereas some power supplies, the cheaper power supplies, just have all the cables piling out of it and anything you don't use is just hanging around loose. This has got a load of additional ports here that you can add your cables as you require them. So I had my one cable with 4 power ports for hard drives. Well, I figured I've got 4 hard drives, that'd do me quite nicely. So I just had the one cable running in sequence to every hard drive, and then I suddenly twigged I was overloading that one cable. It was needing too much power that it wasn't able to feed all of the hard drives properly. So it was probably just on the cusp when it was trying to power a 2 terabyte, then add in a 4 terabyte that's obviously got a few extra disk layers. It just wasn't able to get it spun up properly for it to be able to access, and it was just making Windows go all batshit. The moment I added a second cable in and split the power to the hard drives, all working perfectly. And that old 2 terabyte isn't squeaking anymore. So it means I've now got an extra hard drive that I can stuff into my machine, but that means I need space for another hard drive that this case doesn't have, and I also need the extra power cables as well, so hence I've gone back to an ATX case. Whoever designed the release system on this motherboard is an absolute tool. So, hard drive out. Hard drive? That's a graphics card, Dave. Wake up. Motherboard. Right, while I'm doing the motherboard, we'll get on to the next question. Ben Delves. 2 questions from Ben. Any recommendations on a budget-friendly photo printer, and would you consider arranging photo meetups / walks? Well, unfortunately, Ben, in terms of the photo printer, I'm probably not the person to ask on that, because, in all honesty, I don't really print that many photos. I get photos printed, but I don't really print them myself. The printer that I've got at the moment is an Epson. It's a couple of years old. I have printed photos on it. Get some half decent quality photo paper, set it to best quality photo settings, and it does an alright job. Like I said, I've printed some small tabletop frames in it, but I've never gone anything particularly big. Anything that I've got big printed on walls around the house and stuff, I've usually had them done by an external company. I've just paid someone to do it for me. So can't really help you on the photo printer there, unfortunately. In terms of photo walks, photo meetups and stuff, I don't know, I've always been a little bit dubious, always been a little bit unsure. I kind of just get the feeling that I'd organise a photo meetup and no one would turn up. And then it would just be me walking around like an idiot. Just another day at the office, really. I don't know if many people are actually that close to me or not. I know from my analytics, most of the people who watch my videos are based over in the States, and I doubt anyone's going to fly across the Atlantic to come and have a walk with me. But hey, if you guys can get over to the northwest of England and you do want to have a photo meetup, leave a comment down below, and if we've got enough people, I'll organise one. So that's the motherboard, processor and everything out. Case is pretty much empty. Before I start loading it in, I'll run through what gear I've got here in terms of hardware, just in case anyone's curious. So the processor on this is an Intel i7-8700. Not the K, just the regular. Then 4 8GB sticks of RAM, totaling 32GB. It's DDR4 2666, which is as fast as the processor will handle. And on the topic of RAM, 32GB, well too excessive. All I'm going to say. You don't need 32GB, because I did some tests with this. Lightroom or Photoshop, whenever you do any editing with that, never goes close to maxing out the RAM. They use very little RAM in real terms. I think it probably maxed out around 8, maybe 10GB at most when I've been doing editing. Premiere Pro is the most RAM intensive software that I've got, at least in the editing phase. And when I've monitored that, doing rendering and exporting, even though I've told Premiere Pro that it can use about 25GB of the available 32, it never used more than about 17. I don't know whether it just can't handle it or what, but the most it actually needed was 17GB. So even if you've got a 16GB setup, you allocate like 2GB spare for everything else, you're not far off, presumably, maxing out what it's capable of. Or if there's some hack to allow it to use more than the 16GB, please let me know, because I have a ton of it sitting redundant otherwise. And the graphics card is a GTX 1660 Ti. Now, again, the Premiere Pro, editing, all that stuff, when you actually monitor it, it's not particularly intensive on the graphics card. I think at most Premiere Pro pushed about 70% of what this thing's capable of. So that's an old dusty case out the way, and we'll get the new shiny case in. Now this, again, in case anyone actually cares, is the Corsair 100R. I'll rip that off at the end. Best part of anything new, removing the sticky peels. And the main reason why I got this, well, twofold. One, it was cheap, it cost me about 50 quid. Secondly, there's loads of space in here now. So we've got 4 dedicated hard drive slots down the bottom, which are going to fit all 4 of my spin discs in there. And then there's also 2 5.5-inch trays up here that I could fit more stuff in if I wanted to. So, happy days. Let's start on the new build, the rebuild, and we'll get another question up. So, Maven Sony. Can we and should we learn a British accent when there's almost nobody around to even talk English? Prince Ding. Good APS-C zoom lens with an aperture of 2.8 or larger. Too difficult to find good compact APS-C lenses. Indeed it is, especially if it's a manufacturer who's got a full frame lineup as well, because I think they focus more of their attention to the full frame lineup and the lenses, kind of in the hope that you will buy the full frame lenses and then you'll end up upgrading to a full frame body further down the line. It's just trying to push you to get that little bit extra. Obviously, it's great if you're a Fuji user because they only do APS-C and they do some awesome lenses. Although also quite expensive as well. But I'm guessing you're not on Fuji. I'm guessing you're probably Canon, Nikon or Sony, but you didn't specify whether it's which one it is or whether it's a DSLR or a mirrorless. So it's kind of difficult to give you a definitive answer here. 2.8 or wider aperture zooms, there's not many about, is there? If you're on Sony, you've got that new 16 to 55 f2.8, which looks like a fantastic lens, but it's bloody expensive for what it is. I also don't know what sort of focal range you're going for, whether you're talking kind of general zoom, wide angle, telephoto, or what. The only 2 faster than 2.8 APS-C lenses are the Sigma 18 to 35 and 50 to 150 f1. Is it 150 or 100? Sigma 50 to 100 f1.8s. Now, the pair of those, both fast aperture zoom lenses, in terms of image quality, from what I've seen, look really, really good. I've never personally used them, but I have heard a lot of good things about them. But I've also heard a lot of bad things, people saying that the autofocus isn't particularly good on them. Now, if you're using them on a DSLR, yes, Sigma lenses, I know from past experience, can be kind of temperamental when it comes to autofocus. But if you're using them adapted on a mirrorless body, I've never had a problem with them. Other than that, you're kind of scuppered. You've probably got 17 to 50 mm f2.8 Sigma, which is an older lens. Again, does an alright job. Pretty sure Tamron do one as well. Yeah, most of the 2.8 zooms that I can think of now are kind of a bit long in the tooth and due an update, but I'm probably not going to see that, especially from DSLRs, because most manufacturers now are focusing more on mirrorless. But Russ, can you think of any 2.8 zoom APS-Cs? No? No. He doesn't know either. Right, moving on. So, new case. Hard drive tray. I love these quick release hard drive trays. It was one thing about the previous Cooler Master case I loved. It's the fact that you can just load a hard drive into the tray and just slide it in. That other ones, everything's screw them all in. I hated it. And I've got more fans to deal with again now. So this particular case, the power supply's down at the bottom. I've got holes on the front for 2 fans. Holes on the top for 2 fans, and a fan included on the back. So I can have up to 5 fans here. I have to try and control myself and not go overkill like I did last time. Sometimes you really do just have to stop and think, what do I actually need out of all of this? But anyway, let's get another question on the go while I'm faffing with all that as well. So, Edward Noble. Are you happy with the Sony cameras and lenses after switching from Canon? Would you choose differently in the current climate? And if not, would anything else make you switch? I knew a question would come out along these sorts of lines. It was inevitable. Am I happy with the Sony gear? Yes. If I wasn't, I would have switched by now. Again, it's what do you need out of the gear? What is it about your current gear you're not happy with? What would another manufacturer offer you that you can't get from the one you've got? And I mean, I'm not saying you see me this way, Edward, but there are a lot of people, I think, who just assume that I have this vendetta against Canon, that I just despise everything Canon, and that was why I swapped them, and I've got some love and affiliation of Sony. And honestly, people probably won't believe this, but that is honestly not the case. I was a Canon shooter for many years. Part of the appeal of the whole mirrorless setup for me is that smaller, lighter body, and if I could get some smaller, lighter lenses to go with it and just bring the whole weight of my kit down. And that for me is the biggest thing that's keeping me aligned with Sony at the moment, is the smaller, lighter lenses, that they are more focused on those smaller f1.8s. Nikon are obviously doing f1.8s as opposed to f1.4 primes at the moment, but they're really expensive. They're probably really good quality, but they're quite expensive as well. Canon's philosophy is sticking more with the big lenses, which is exactly what I tried to get away from in the first place. If Canon brought out 1.8 lenses, would I switch back to them? Again, no, not at the minute, because there's nothing about the Sony setups that... There's things about the Sony setup that do get on my tits at times. You know, the menu systems are a pain, but you get used to them after a while. Yeah, the colour science straight out of camera isn't quite as good as some manufacturers, but you adapt to those. You know, with presets and stuff, you can work around most of those problems anyway. Where have I put the screwdriver? There it is. So there's aspects of the Sony cameras that I hope could be improved, but nothing at the minute that would make me want to switch to a different manufacturer. If the cameras that I've got, the A7 III and the A6400, at any point aren't enough for me, or aren't fulfilling what I need, then I will look at changing them. For example, the A6400. Love shooting video with the A6400, but the battery life is atrocious. But I can work around that. If it was really that much of a problem for me, I wouldn't switch to a different manufacturer, I'd just get the A6600 instead. So I'm never going to rule out switching to a different manufacturer, but I'm not going to switch until there is a time when I actually need to switch. And so far, there's nothing that would make me want to switch. I'm going here. So yeah, in the current climate, no, I personally have no need to switch. Again, that's not to say that people shouldn't switch, but it's everyone's individual, and it depends on what you need out of the gear. For me, at the moment, my Sony gear is fulfilling what I want from it. You know, climates will probably change. You know, 4K is becoming more popular, slowly. 8K is hitting the market now as well, so at the minute I'm filming a lot of videos in 4K 30 and then throwing 1080 120 over the top of it and having to upscale it. Maybe at some point in the future there will be, you know, 4K 120 is going to become more of a thing. It's already started to become a thing, but you know, maybe it will become more mainstream and I'll decide I want it. If at that point it is a big deal for me and Sony haven't gone on the bandwagon of that yet, which I don't see as likely that they wouldn't get on it, then that might justify me switching to a different manufacturer. But it's obviously, you've got to weigh up the pros and cons of, I've then got all the lenses to consider as well, and that's the biggest thing for me, is it's going to take more than a couple of fancy features here and there to make me switch. It's the lenses as well. What's in this here bag? Various size screws. I have no idea what any of these are for. And obviously the instructions are here unopened, because I know best. I don't. But it's far more fun to guess and then rant when things don't go the way you want them to. Any more questions? No. Oof. Who knows? Maybe if I do another one of these videos in the future, there might be, you You know, some more of you have other questions for me. Or you'll already switched off by now and there'll be no questions whatsoever. So, motherboard's back in place. The rest of it's more straightforward now, so I think we can fast forward through the next bit. All done. That was more of an ordeal than I thought. Now, there is only one thing left to do, which is the bit I know we've all been waiting for, which is get a side panel on and it's like porn for geeks. But you wasn't expecting that for a video, hey. So, who knows? Hopefully that has answered the photography related questions that you guys had for me. Maybe it's even answered a few computer related questions that you didn't even realise you had. But as always guys, if you have any other questions or queries, leave them in the comments down below. Let me know what you thought of this sort of video. Is it something you'd like to see more of, or do you think I should just maybe leave projects in the bin? And also let me know what you think about the whole photo walk idea. If that's something that you are interested in, if you're kind of local to me, maybe we'll get that organised. But that's pretty much it for this video, guys. If you haven't already, please consider hitting the subscribe button, and there is also a link to my Patreon account and merch store as well. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.